I can't hear you. Oh, thank you.
Are we still live? Told you before, I don't have to use a microphone anymore. It's this quiet. So thank you all for being here this evening. I have the great honor of introducing a priest who happens to be a friend. And so Father Timothy Pavlatos currently serves as the priest at St. Catherine's the Greek Orthodox Church in Chandler, Arizona. He was, in many of his many hats that he wore before that, Director of Family Wellness for the metropolis of San Francisco. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, a certified clinical trauma professional, had private practice here in the Northwestern Oregon for 6 years. He was an adjunct professor at George Fox University. He was an associate priest here at St. John the Baptist. He and his wife, Presbytera Victoria, have been married since 1995, have 9 children, 2 grandchildren. He has lectured and conducted many, many retreats on marriage, parenting, addiction, a lot of other wellness topics. And what else is there to say other than he's proven great patience, having been both my confessor and a golf partner out on the golf course. So, Father Timothy.
May want to wait to applaud until after the lecture. Well, it's wonderful to be back in the Northwest after the last 4 years down in the desert, and you can't get 2 more opposite places, I think, in this country in terms of just about everything. So it's beautiful to step into the really cool weather and to see the greenery and everything else that we love so much when we were here. So let me start out by saying that what I'm going to be presenting tonight and then the 2 lectures tomorrow are all new material. I've been working on this for the last several weeks, and so you're my test group for all of this new information. Yes. Yeah, there's paper and pen if you all want. So this is all new material, and I feel I'm taking a little bit of a risk because I'm going to present some material that I feel goes more to the depth, the inner self. And in the past, in the marriage retreats that I've done, a lot of the material were on sort of practical things when it comes to relationships. And what I mean by that is we would focus on communication and how to learn to be better at communicating, conflict resolution, those sort of things. And I'm completely open to talking about that or answering questions that you may have surrounding that. But in my years as a therapist, and mostly as a husband, I have learned that at the core of our struggles with my wife and I, and the struggles that we've had, and we've been married 27 years, and we have a beautiful marriage, but we've had some really hard times, really, really challenging moments in our marriage. And in all the personal work that we have done, and the work that we've done as a couple, I've learned some things that I feel really is vital in terms of our relationship and how to work on our relationship. So that's what I'm going to be addressing. So this is probably going to sound a little bit different. And it's going to maybe push you a little bit to think about yourself as we go through the material here. So I just am warning you that that's what's coming. And I don't know how it's going to be, but I'm very interested to know from you once we get to the end of this. Tonight and tomorrow morning, the first lecture are more of the meat of everything. And then the third one is going to be a little bit lighter, but I'd like to leave time for more Q&A about all of the topics that we discuss or anything that comes up. So I'm speaking primarily out of my own lived experience as a husband and the work that I've had to do on myself as a person, and the work that my wife has had to do as an individual, and then what we've done collectively. And we've both gone through counseling individually, and we've been through marriage counseling with one of the top Orthodox psychotherapists around. And we had to fly across the country to do that, but it was worth it. And so, again, what I'm sharing is a lot of it's coming out of my own learned experience, both as a therapist and sitting with couples, and then my own story. So tonight, the topic is there's more to the story. And the question then is, what's the story, right? And the story is each of our personal journey, our early life narrative, the story of our relationship history, primarily within the context of our home and the environment in which we were raised and formed. I find that it has been extremely valuable, helpful, and I would say necessary to look at our relational history from our most formative years, because it can provide a lot of valuable and important information. It helps us to see we have come to understand ourselves in a certain way and how we have come to function interpersonally in all of our current relationships. In doing this, it can help us make sense of some things when it comes to our daily interactions with our spouse, especially with them and those that we're closest with in our families. There's a couple of quotes I wanted to share with you just about story and history. Winston Churchill had said that those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this made a lot of sense to me as I'm looking at it through the lens of marriage and of just relationship. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I consider myself a relationship therapist. And when I look at the history of relationships in the family of origin that I grew up in, I witnessed and experienced that first marriage relationship with my parents. And so in witnessing that as a child, of course, we're processing and we're experiencing it in our own way where we are developmentally. And much later in life, though, we can look back and we can think about it and we can process it differently because we're adults now. And so as I have done a lot of work around family of origin and just learning about my own family and the relationship dynamics there, I started putting pieces of the puzzle together in terms of my own life, as well as my own marriage. And though Churchill was speaking about history in terms of world and culture and society, it certainly applies to our personal history and our current relationship and the circumstances that we're in. We typically say, I'm going to do things differently than what my parents did. My marriage is going to be different. I'm going to change this or change that or whatever it may be because we want something better, right? And hopefully, as adults, in terms of our marriage and in terms of parenting, we always want to do a better job than our parents. And our hope is that our kids will do better than we did. And that's what we want to pass down generationally. When you look at family systems, we have these sort of generational dynamics that keep occurring in families in a negative way. And so if we have the wherewithal, if we have the desire, then we're going to do what we need to do to make those changes within ourselves so that we're bettering what we have here and now, but also we're providing something for our children in the future. Because the way we relate as a married couple greatly influences our children's understanding of marriage and relationships in general. Some of us can be successful in accomplishing this, even though all of our marriages will have challenges, even if we're doing a better job. The question is, how can we make them better? What can we do? What can we change? Some may say, well, it's really my husband who needs to change. If he changes, things will be much better. Or it's my wife who needs to get her stuff together. She's really the issue and whatever, and we're working on things, but she's the one that has to really make the changes. The reality is we can only work on ourselves. So knowing from where we have come, and when we first started learning about how to relate to others, and that providing the information for us, this is what we have to start doing. We have to start looking at our own narrative, our own story. Edmund Burke said, in history, a great volume is unrolled for our instruction, drawing on the materials of future wisdom from the past eras and infirmities of mankind. I took the liberty to rephrase this for the purpose of this marriage retreat, and it sounds something like this. In our personal relational history, a great volume is unrolled for our instruction, drawing on our experiences from both the good and the harm done by others, whether that was harm done intentionally or unintentionally, whether that harm was physical or emotional. It's still a part of our history, and it still has impacted us, and we carry that with us. Our past reveals our motivations and our emotional triggers. And if we're willing and train ourselves to pay close attention to ourselves, we'll discover that we have parts of us that have very specific roles that are intended for very specific purposes. Because history gives us the tools to analyze and explain our past relational experiences, it positions us to see patterns that might otherwise be outside of our awareness, but providing a crucial perspective for understanding the current challenges that we have in our marriage. The identity we each live with today, what we call I or me, is a collection of our experiences, everything we have learned and traits that we've inherited. When I say I have learned to ask myself, which I is speaking? Is it the I, that part of me that needs to protect myself from being hurt, from feeling rejected, or feeling unappreciated? Is it the I that wants to escape and forget and to numb out? Is it the I that overfunctions and endlessly strives for perfection? St. Paul spoke about a part of himself that didn't do things he knew he wanted to do, and a part that wanted to do those things that were right. He says in Romans, I don't understand what I do. That's really a question for ourselves. He says, for what I want to do, I don't do. But what I hate, that's what I do. I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This is what I keep on doing. So even the great St. Paul had this inner conflict, these parts of him that he was struggling with. He attributes the struggle, of course, to the sin that dwells in him. And it's the same with us. We know sin dwells in us, and we also know that we have suffered from the sins of others, which in turn has created within us a couple of things. One, a distorted sense of who we are. And two, defense mechanisms which protect us from being hurt again. And both of these accompany us throughout life, and they get activated in us at different times in various situations and in our relationships. And it's helpful to know what they are and when they're operating. I've worked with a lot of couples where either one or both have presented a distorted view of themselves. And having grown up in a less than favorable home environment, whether they experience neglect, abuse, shaming, rigidity, an alcoholic father, the divorce of parents, whatever, they have come to see themselves as something other than how God intended them to see themselves, which is beloved. Christ essentially says to us, "You are everything to me." Despite your flaws, your disobedience, your sinfulness, you mean everything to me, which is why I have given my life to you. Many people I've sat with instead see themselves as not good enough, incompetent, unlovable. And though they may not use those words to describe themselves, they function in their relationship from these places of mistaken identity. We can also say that who we are in truth was established from the moment of the creation of man. In Genesis, we read, God said, "Let us make mankind in our image according to our likeness." So God created man in his image, and in the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So who we are is already determined, and it's not negotiable. Our worth and our value is very clear. But how we have come to see ourselves can be very, very different. And that affects the way that we relate to one another, especially to our most beloved in our marriage. We also read in the Gospel of John, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should never perish but have everlasting life." On top of that, we didn't need to become good enough to receive this. Because as St. Paul says in Romans, God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Yet we can go through life feeling the opposite of how God wants us to feel and know ourselves. So if we have come to believe something else about ourselves, it's false. Growing up, for example, in a home, a young boy may be told by his father that he's stupid, or that he's not going to amount to anything, or he's worthless. And this young boy hears this constantly growing up. Over time, what do you think happens? He begins to believe that as truth. How do you think that's going to affect him later on in life when he starts to get into relationship with other people, especially the one whom he wants to spend the rest of his life with? It will affect him in that relationship. Many people I speak with, looking at themselves only from the context of their lived relational experiences, have come to believe things about themselves that in reality aren't true. Yet for them, it's absolute truth. Living out of a false identity, they also have never thought to sit with the emotions that come up under certain circumstances and to just be curious about them. Instead, they beat themselves up over them. They don't ask the question, where is this coming from? What are these feelings, these thoughts, these emotions that I'm having inside of me? What are they all about? Brene Brown, how many of you have heard of Brene Brown? She's one of my favorite non-Orthodox authors. She's a researcher and also a professor at the University of Houston, I believe. And she has written many books, and she has spoken at the highest level in government and other places, talking about her research. And that there are many, many good, many great books that she's written and many quotes. But I wanted to show you a very brief video clip, and it's called, "Are You Hooked on a False Story?"
Of imperfection is be you. Daring greatly is be all in.
Can you hear it?
And Rising
Yeah.
Strong is fall, learn, get up, and do it again. And so it's the most personal book because as I was writing it, really the heart of this book is about these really dangerous stories we make up when we're in the midst of struggle, when we're in a fall. We are neurobiologically hardwired to make sense of that fall, to make sense of our hurt as fast as we can. And if we can come up with a story that makes sense of it, our brain chemically rewards us for that story, whether it's accurate or not. And so for me, what became very important is to write a book to help people understand when you fall, the stories you make up about your fall need to be really tested. And so as I was writing it, what I realized was that my stories of failure and heartbreak were the ones that gave me the most access to understanding what was happening behind the scenes in the story. Because we all do it. We all do it. I mean, if you and I finish this interview and we walk down the hill and I say, thanks a lot, I really appreciate it. You go like this. My brain takes that as anxiety or fear, and I immediately make up a story. I knew she never liked me. That Super Soul Sunday really sucked. I didn't do the right thing. It was terrible. And then all of a sudden, I'm working up a whole narrative. How I treat you the next time I see you is off that narrative. Wow. And then, it just keeps going and going.
So how do we make sure that, or know that the story that we're telling ourselves is in alignment with what actually did happen? Yeah,
That's the Rising Strong process.
That's the Rising Strong process.
Right. So if we use that example of just you and I together. And so there's three pieces: the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. The reckoning has two seemingly easy, but pretty difficult pieces. The first thing I have to do is when you look at me like that and I feel something in response to it, I have to acknowledge, a button's been pushed. I've been hooked on something emotional is happening here. I'm responding. And then I have to be willing to get curious about what it is. So instead of immediately going to my crazy story, I have to go to, okay, I'm emotionally hooked around something. I don't know what just happened, but I'm feeling like stressed out about it, or it hurt my feelings or something, and I need to figure out more. I mean, and
The reckoning is actually the recognition of it.
reckoning. Something emotional has happened. And the big piece of the reckoning. And this is the part that really shocked me, is I'm willing to get curious and look into it.
Yeah.
Do you know how many people are not curious about emotion because that was just drilled out of us growing up?
Okay. What did you think about that?
It's accurate.
It's accurate, okay. What was she talking about? What was she talking about? What did she say in there?
How your inner dialogue affects how you live out your life.
Yes. How your inner dialogue and even your inner perception and how you process incoming information, how it starts to affect you. The biggest thing that she said in that was that if she looks at me a certain way, or there's some nonverbal communication, like she demonstrated if Oprah did that it immediately triggered something in her, right? And then from that come all these thoughts. She doesn't like me, all this stuff. It's that connection of something happens in our relationship. My wife may say something, or she may not say something when I would expect that she would. She may do something, or she may not do something. Or she may do something in a way, and what happens is it triggers something in me. And the moment it triggers something in me, I have this emotional response. And then out of that emotional response is going to come my behavior and my words. And I can tell you it's not going to be good or positive. It's that sort of thing that I want you to focus on. It is what is going on inside of me. And she demonstrated that too when she said, as soon as she looked at her or whatever, she said she knew something was triggered. And instead of just kind of letting the thoughts hijack the mind and start coming up with all these scenarios of what it could mean, and we're so adept at doing this. It's so automatic. We think the worst right away, and then we react. We get upset. We get we can become very defensive. We can just turn away from the person. There's a sort of this explosion, and you know what that feels like. It's the worst feeling because you're talking about your most beloved. It is the worst feeling, but something really big is happening. And most of the time, none of that is acknowledged. None of it is talked about. None of it is acknowledged within the person. And that's the one thing that my wife and I really worked on, is that when something is triggered in one of us, we recognize it and we articulate it. I was just triggered. I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying, you did that because you said that, I feel this way. And that's the path that we typically go down. And we can get to a place as a couple to acknowledge, I was just triggered by that. And then she can be curious and say, well, what was it? And I can say, well, it's when you use that word, or I perceived a certain tone and I interpret that tone in a certain way, and that really makes me angry. And if we can stay back from getting defensive or defending ourselves and just listen and be curious, that's when connection begins to really happen. And that's when we begin to really work together as a team to understand one another, what's going on. And I have to say that there was a lot of thought and time I know I had to put into preparing myself, that when a moment arises like that, that I have to be ready for it. And I think that unless we do that, we're never ready. And we just react. We get to a place though, when that whole scenario, when it really comes down really fast, we get to a place where we know something's happening, and then we both get really curious about it. And I have to always remember, she's not my enemy. She's not my mom. She's not my dad. She's not whoever that I have had issues with. And now I'm pulling all of that past into the present, and now I'm sort of attacking her, and it doesn't even belong there. It's just the unresolved stuff that really goes back in time. But the past comes cascading into the present moment and just really whips people around. So just being able to sense that is really, really important, is to know that something happened. And I remember speaking with a dear friend of mine who taught me a lot about this and worked with me a lot on this. And we were in Brookline, Massachusetts. We were at a conference together, and we were taking a walk around Jamaica Pond. And I was asking him, how do you become more sensitive to what's happening in here, and then becoming aware of it when it's happening, and then being able to sort of respond to it in a way that you're not allowing yourself to become completely overrun by the emotions to where you're going to attack. And we just started talking about noticing. And later then I received my training in trauma. And that's where it really began to open up, because the body is so important to trauma healing. And we were walking, and he said, okay, I just want you, as we're walking, to notice that when you're taking each step, I want you to feel the ground under your feet. And so when I was walking, I just started paying attention to my feet, and when I would step on the ground each time, and just observing the sensation. That was just a very simple sort of exercise. In trauma treatment, we refer to this sort of thing as grounding. You know, when someone is in a trauma response, one of the things we try to help people do is to ground themselves, because they can dissociate very quickly. And so, for example, I was working with a young girl. We were sitting down on two armchairs, And as she started to have this trauma response, she talked about it. You know, she was able to articulate what's going on. And so I saw her hands were on the armchairs. And I said, you know, I want you just to focus for a moment on your hands touching the armchair. And I want you just to just focus there. Think about that. Feel the material. Feel your hand touching the material. Squeeze it a little bit and let go. And what that does is it takes them out of a trauma response, right? Because they're focusing and they're thinking about something else. In a very similar way, being able to train ourselves to notice when something's happening is really, really important. It's really our hope to regulate ourselves. And it's not, it takes us out of this position of being helpless and depending on someone else to stop it so I can stop feeling this way. It's not an external locus of control anymore. I'm taking that in and I'm saying, I need to regulate myself, and this is how I can do those things. So in my relationship with my wife, we came to this place where we were able to now notice when we were triggered and to say I was triggered, or, you know, or even to just verbalize that, you know, that really hurt, that statement really hurt. And she learned, you know, not to say, well, you make statements that hurt me, right? But she learned to say, you know, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intention. Where do you think that conversation is going to go? It's going to go to a good place, right? But the minute we start just going back and forth, it never goes to a good place. Part of being in a relationship is sharing our story. And my wife and I have spent years sharing our story. When we first met, we shared a lot of our story, our history, our relational history of past. And I'm not talking about dating and things like that. I'm talking about really family of origin stuff. And some pretty deep things, you know. And years later, I mean, gosh, we've been married 27 years. So I'd say maybe 23, 24 years later, you know, we're still imperfect going through the path of marriage, right? It's like you don't just figure it out one day and then all of a sudden you just have this great marriage and you never have any struggles or problems or anything like that. That's never the case. You learn how to manage and work in a way that whenever the stuff comes up, that you're doing it in a way that is actually with kindness and love, and you're not in a battle and a fight with one another, okay? And 25 years later, and after, you know, the amount of work that we've done as individuals and as a couple, she shared some things, and I believe that she had shared them before, but I didn't hear them. You know, there's almost like there's only so much that we can process and take in. And as she started to share more information or the same information, that I was in a place then to hear it, it was incredible. In an instant, I saw her like I'd never seen her before. And to me, that is a notable moment in the history of one's marriage, is to know something about someone when you think you know everything about them, but it's so profound that it changes you. And it changed me, and it changed in the way that I lived in relationship to her. It was like I just got it, and it was deep, it was painful, it was personal, but it was so enlightening, and it was life-changing. When we explore and share our parts of our past with our spouses, we're sharing information that is essential towards keeping our relationship alive and moving forward. First of all, our spouse won't be spending a lifetime trying to figure us out. I mean, that alone can cause complications and insecurities, right? If we're just always shut down and we're not really talking about anything. We all have our scripts in our minds, and sensitivities are raw spots that when rubbed cause us to react. It's a wound that's still there, and when it gets rubbed, it causes reaction. I remember years ago in graduate school, I think the author was Charles Gherkin, but it was a book called The Living Human Documents. What a title, right? Because that's what we are. We're living human documents. And we have all these pages. Now, the pages of tomorrow, we don't have yet, right? And that can bring a lot of hope too. People I've worked with who are dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of difficulties in life, I use that sort of metaphor, that analogy, that, you know, this right now, right where we are on a page that's in a chapter that's in our book. But that page turns, and then there's going to be a new page, and eventually there's going to be a new chapter. And that's sort of how life just goes on and evolves. When we have these moments of reaction to our spouse, you know, in such instances, we may withdraw, we may shut down, we may strike back, where we know it hurts the other person. These are part of our defense mechanisms, which just lead to further disconnection, feelings of isolation and loneliness and pain. We go into survival mode. It's what we know. It's part of our story. It's what served us at a particular time and for good reason. But it's no longer needed. But we still use it. We haven't learned to get out of that. There's an image that I use quite often that sort of describes this. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It's very profound. So I look at this as a husband and wife who are struggling, fighting at odds. They're both hurting, and we turn away from each other when that happens. But inside us is that person. Some refer to it as the inner child, whatever you want to say. But there's that part of us that desires, longs for connection with the other, longs for it, and doesn't know how to get it. And the other one may not even know how to receive it, but it is given. But this is what our longing is. We are created as relational beings. We're created in the image of a relational God. The whole life is about relationships. Everything. Not only vertically or horizontally, but vertically with God. What are the two greatest commandments? What did Christ say? Number one, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. And the second, aren't those relationships? The two greatest commandments are about relationships. This is our life, people. And unfortunately, for many, I won't say all, but for many, as they're being brought up and they're formed and shaped in their system, and the relationships, the people that are there that are affecting that, they come up out of that having a false identity. And they don't know how to relate to other people. And because of that false identity, and I'll use this word lightly, although it can be actually true, the trauma of not learning and knowing what it is to have a healthy, loving relationship and home environment affects them throughout their life, unless they start to realize and start to make some changes. Saint Isaac the Syrian said something very profound when it comes to this. He says, to know ourselves as we truly are is a greater miracle than to raise the dead. Think about that. I think raising the dead is pretty awesome. Only read about it. Haven't seen it. I believe it. But when he says that it's a greater miracle for us to know who we truly are, that to me is very, very profound. And I see two parts to that. One is to know ourselves within the context of our relational experiences. The I that I see myself as, from what I've experienced as I was growing up, the messages, that I received, the sense of who I am as developed through those messages. And two, to know myself as created in the image of God, right? The purpose for which I was created, the life I've been given, my true self, a beloved child in God, my true identity. With the first part, there may need to be some deprogramming or some undoing because we've developed sort of this unhealthy sense of who we are. So that, the second part sort of comes with my life experiences. If any of you have received an email from me recently, or in the last year or two, you'll notice at the bottom of all my emails, there's a little saying. And this saying actually is a prayer, and a prayer that came to me through my lived experiences. Because I grew up in the home that I grew up in a completely emotionally detached, absent father and an alcoholic mother, my sense of self and who I am was very distorted. That carries on later in life. I'm not good enough. I have to prove myself. I'm inadequate at things. And, you know, maybe all my achievements, bachelor degree, 2 master's degrees, certifications, audit, yada, 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 all these things have come because I'm still trying to prove myself to my dad. And he's dead. He's not even around. I'm still trying to prove myself. And so I have this, and I'll use this word later, I have this, the merciless perfecter who's always in my head. You know who the merciless perfecter is? Satan. And it's never good enough. It's always questions and doubts and all of these things that keep plaguing. And that alone has had a huge impact in my relationship and my marriage. Huge. So this prayer came because I was ardently praying and asking God for help. And it wasn't a prayer that just came boom in my head and it was like all well written out and all that, but it came over a short period of time. And then it dawned on me that that's sort of what it was. And so I wrote it out. And what it is, Lord, help me to see and love myself as you see me and love me. And help me to see and love all people as you see and love all people. Because I knew that I was not seeing myself correctly. And I was exhausted. I couldn't take it anymore. My prayer, Lord, help me to see me as you see me. Because that's true, that's real. That's exactly what I want. I don't want to see myself through the distorted lens of all my past relational experiences that helped sort of create this image of myself in my own mind and who I was as a person. So help me to see myself and love myself as you see me and love me. Because we are supposed to love ourselves, right? Isn't that in scripture too? Love your neighbor as. Yeah. And we're not talking about, you know, that sort of self narcissism and this sort of stuff. We're just talking about a healthy love of self as being ones created in the image and likeness of God. And help me also to see and love all people as you see and love all people. Because when I can start to get to that place, I'm not going to judge people. I'm not going to get angry at people. I'm going to make excuses for people instead of getting angry at them. Where do we see that in scripture? The most profound example of that. Yes. The ones who crucified, or the ones that Christ allowed to crucify him, we say that theologically correct, right? He says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Now we could say, I think they knew exactly what they were doing. And I can't understand why you would even say that. They just murdered you. So when we begin to see and love all people as God sees and loves all people, then the way that we relate to them is going to be not just different, it's going to be godly. So why wouldn't we want that? This prayer is, for me, it's been so powerful. I continue to pray it. And I can tell you this too, it's working. Don't think for a moment it doesn't work. It works. And I think the main reason why it's been working, and I thank God for his mercy and grace, because that's why it's working. But I was praying it out of the depth of the pain in my heart. It wasn't just something I was reading or saying. It was coming from a really, really, painful place. So there's this part of us, there's part of this prayer, or part of this to know ourselves as we truly are. One is that part. I want to know myself as Christ knows me, as He loves me, as He sees me, and all of that. But the other part of it is I know that I had to do a lot of work on sort of unpacking and deprogramming what I had experienced all my life. I had to have sort of a right understanding of that, and that came through God's grace, of course, but it also came through God's grace through another person who helped me to see that as well. And the beautiful thing that they find out about in interpersonal neurobiology, which is a term that was coined by Dr. Daniel Siegel, some of you probably heard this, but the brain, it's called plasticity, right? It's always developing and changing and growing and whatever. And so when we're growing up and we're going through these experiences, we're developing these neural connections, and as they're repeated, those connections become very, very strong. So it becomes a part of really our neurological makeup. And what they have found through imaging is that those neural connections can be weakened to the point of actually being severed, and that new ones can be formed. So that in itself, in terms of just voting well for therapy, is pretty cool. If you get the right therapist and a good therapist, right? But that relationship in itself may be the only relationship that some people have that's actually modeling something that's healthy and good, right? So you can form these new things. So that's part of the undoing from sort of a neurological perspective. And obviously there's the heart as well. In the book of Psalms, King David says, "For you have created my innermost parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you because I am awesomely and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." Now, when I read that, I'm thinking, right, King David wasn't always a good guy. I mean, who am I to say who's good and who's not? But, he did some things in life that just weren't right for him, good for his heart, good for his relationship with God. But to utter these words to me, it's very beautiful. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. I know people who can say, my soul doesn't know that. I don't know that about myself. I don't see that. Okay? That in itself tells you something. And it's like, all right, that's where we start. That's where we're going to start. And then you kind of work backwards. But when you do that, you start to hear the story, the rest of the story, the narrative. And a lot of people never get that opportunity to really talk about their story. And when it comes to marriages, it's important. I'm not saying you got to sit down and just like pull everything out of the closet and just start talking about everything and hash it out and work it out. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, if you want to, get serious about it, then there are steps you can take. I'm just talking about in the moment when a conflict happens, that we begin to see that something's happening inside of me. And I may not know what it is. I've come to a place in my life where I know what it is, 9 times out of 10, because I've done the work. I know where that's coming from, and I can speak to it. And Presbyter and I have that knowledge about each other. But for a lot of people, they're not even close to that yet. But you start somewhere. A beautiful quote. I wanted to share that with you. One of the most helpful things in my marriage was that both my wife and I call it, we became archaeologists of sorts, and with the help of a really beautiful therapist. And as I said before, really through time and effort and God's help, we explore the worlds we grew up in and the influences those worlds and those environments had on our formation. And it wasn't scary anymore. It was interesting. it didn't always evoke like warm feelings, but it was like, it's okay. We don't have to be scared of this. We don't have to worry about this. And that's what happens is that we're fearful of what we think may happen. In trauma, we call that a perceived threat, which is very different than a real threat. We call that a perceived threat. I can't go there. I don't know. I buried that. That's so far. That's fine. You know, and in trauma, and the way I learned trauma therapy is you don't go back, because the old school trauma is you got to get back, you got to take it all out, you got to unpack it, you got to look at it, you got to feel it, you got to work through it, that's not the trauma therapy that I learned. It's, you only go back when you're stuck, because something's keeping you stuck. Other than that, then we have other things that we can do, because it's really a matter of managing our trauma responses, you know, the activation of our sympathetic nervous system and those sort of things. And we can learn ways to engage that so that we can regulate. But there are times where we just hit a wall, get stuck, and we're not moving forward. So that's that moment in time. Let's look at that for a moment, okay? But we became archaeologists. We slowly began to see how the past wasn't in the past, but alive and well in the present. How our ways of survival were active at times in our marriage, and how quickly and easily we would default into those ways in speaking and behaving, ways that we had learned in the past. And for a long time, we were unaware of this happening. We thought we were just in the moment, not realizing how our past and ways of interacting in order to survive were now prohibiting us from trusting one another and from loving one another. Any questions? Let me stop there for a moment. Breathe. Deep breath. Yes.
So if it seems like it would be easier if you came from a background of this trauma, dysfunction, to be able to look back on that and see, explore that as the source of some of this suffering. But if you don't think that that was what your background was.
Let's say you grew up in a sort of a well-functioning, close-knit sort of.
Still have stuff. How do you explore that?
Because you have stuff.
Right, because you have stuff. So
I don't know, I had a great childhood. I can't tell you how many people, when I did sort of a family history with them, we call them genograms in family therapy. I can't tell you how many people gave me that narrative. I had a good life. I had good family, parents. I mean, dad took me to ball games. You know, everything was presented that way. So I know that that's not the full story, but that's the story that he or she has been telling themselves all this time. Why would we tell that narrative as sort of the summary of our experience? Because it's too painful to look at anything outside of that, no matter what it is. So as we began to explore together, right? Just go down the river, and as a guide, I'm just asking, you know, pointing things out, or oh, I noticed that, or, you know, what was that like, or whatever. Within 2 or 3 sessions, then things start coming to the surface. And some of those people would say, I completely buried them. It was repressed, not suppressed, it was repressed, unconsciously, just down. Suppression is when I consciously go down. You know, I know it, but I don't want to talk about it. So there's always something there. And so if I live that narrative, and you could actually come from a good home, right? I mean, you can have very secure attachments, you know, great memories, all that stuff. But if you're getting stuck in your marriage, then there's something there, right? And if my narrative is that it was, you know, gosh, like the Beavers family, you know, Now, some of you, I realize now that I'm older and that show probably wasn't on for half of you that are here. But it wasn't so hunky-dory, beautiful, wonderful, everything was great sort of thing. If that's my narrative, then I'm most likely going to say it's really my wife. I mean, she's kind of an instigator, you know, and she's not an instigator. I don't think anybody's an instigator. I think people act out their pain. That's what they do. But if we label them as instigators, then we label them, right? And that's never good. That's never good. He's passive aggressive. All right, why? I don't know, he just is. He's always been that way. Okay. Are you good with that? You want to move on? No, I want to find out what's going on. Let's talk. Yes. Yes.
So once you understand the narrative, family history, family of origin, does it provide an obligation on each other's parts to change from, because I can see that could be a great way to form an excuse, right?
Yes.
Oh, well, this is the way I am because it was right. I can't help it.
Right.
What is the pathway to say, okay, we are going to change this now. We're going to change this behavior. And we're going to eradicate the influence that has come from our family of origin. And we're going to create a new playbook, if you will.
Yeah, great question. I
Can you
don't,
repeat the question so that it's recorded?
you want to maybe
No,
say,
no, you repeat it because you're mine.
okay. Thank you, John. That's why you're in my life.
The nagging second one.
God knows I need one. Except my wife is not nagging anymore, so you're the only one, John. So let me see if I understand the question correctly. If the purpose of sort of knowing the family of origin and those sort of things is to help us change, to create change so that we can be different, right? Yeah. So I don't use the word change. That to me is like, I don't even really, I mean, that's sort of implied. That's what they want. I just start with, let's understand it. Let's just try to understand what's going on.
So in other words, when the person, your spouse, when they behaves a certain way, you receive it with compassion and empathy and understanding because you understand why that's happening. You don't
Yes.
take it personally.
Yes, once you understand that it can change you in the way that you now function. And let me share with you, this may be later on in here, but I'll say it now because here we are. I had a mentor when I was going through, I'd finished graduate school and I was doing all my hours and whatnot, and I had to meet with him once a week and talk about client cases and things. But he was a family systems guy, and he shared this saying, this adage with me. If we can change the way we see somebody, we can change the way that we function in relationship to them. So let me give you a personal example. My dad, as I said, we were not connected at all. A wonderful provider. He was an attorney, provided for his family, very successful, but I didn't have that father-son relationship. In fact, my experience as a young boy was that I could never do it right. And that's sort of where that belief came out of me about me. And so whether we were working on a car together, whether we were doing something around the yard, whatever it is, there was always a better way to do it, a more efficient way to do it, the right way to do it. No matter what I did, that was what I kept hearing. So I came to not like him. In fact, I came to hate him. I mean, really. But as a young boy and as a teenager, I'm not processing that in any way, right? Like, oh, is this pleasing to God or nothing? I just knew what I felt. And every night he'd come off the driveway from work, I'd go down in my room Mom would call for dinner, we'd have dinner. Sometimes there'd be something happening there, and then I just avoided it. So I really just didn't want anything to do with it. Finished college, went to seminary. I think my second year in seminary, I came home and I visited with my dad's mom, okay, from Greece. Very, very pious, beautiful woman. At this time, she lived to be 105, so I don't know, she must have been like in the late 90s or something. She had been in a wheelchair for 20 years, maybe longer, and I remember sitting at her house, and I just said, hey, I said, what was dad like, my dad like when he was a young boy? I started asking questions, which I never did before. And honestly, it was like a moment in time. It was a God-given moment in time. And I just asked her, and she said, well, he was the youngest. He had two older brothers and older sister. He was always happy and playful. He would sing in the yard, and he was just joyful, always joyful. And, but your Babu, his dad, she said he was really hard. Really hard. As the youngest, I don't know if it's a Greek thing, but the oldest boy was like the old child. Then you have the middle child, they're kind of lost. Then you have the girl, that's the girl. And then there's dad. So he really got the brunt of a lot of stuff. Then he went into World War II. He was in the army. He was a medic. You ever seen Saving Private Ryan? Pretty brutal. So he was a medic, saw a lot of things, came back from the war. So that right there, I think, was enough information. I mean, there was more too, but as she was sharing this story with me, and I was sitting there, I remember it like it was yesterday, when she was talking about him and his dad yelling at him or spanking him. My mind started creating images of this little boy who was crying and hurting and afraid. He didn't want this, but he was getting it. And I saw him just as this young boy just hurting. And he was a boy who would sing and laugh and play, and this image just kept going over and over in my mind. And I started to get really emotional. And I believe that God was showing me that, because once I saw him in that picture, in that image, in that moment, the way I felt about him reversed. It completely changed. And I saw my dad in the absolute opposite way. And my relationship with him changed. But he never changed. He never changed. Never acted differently, never connected, nothing. But our relationship changed because the way I saw him changed the way I began to function in my relationship with him. I had compassion for him. He wasn't just this mean son of a bitch, forgive me for cursing. I had compassion. And that changed everything. And so I had that, for the next few years, because I understood. That was a huge part of his narrative, his story that I had no idea about. And as I came to learn about it, it changed me. And it changed me in the way that I lived my relationship with him. That's the same thing that happened with my wife. Because we took the time to learn, to know the rest of the story. That's why it's important. Let me get through some of this and we'll have some more questions. Just a few words about how the past affects the present in our marriages, and then I can take more questions after that. So first, I don't know if this feels relevant to you. You may say, like Lisa was brought up, I had a good home environment, a good upbringing, attentive parents. And as I said, this certainly can be true. And it definitely leads a person to have a more secure attachment style and a healthier relationship. There's no doubt. Better communication, they can usually be more open because they're used to that. That's been a part of their experience, so they carry it over. The only thing I would say is that when you encounter conflict and challenges in your marriage, as I was saying to Lisa, take note of your thoughts and your body. All right, there's a felt sense that we experience. Have you ever read Bessel van der Kolk, the book, The Body Keeps the Score? It's a phenomenal piece of literature on trauma. The body keeps the score. But our body, it speaks a lot when we're encountering conflict and stuff like that. So we have to pay attention to that and the responses. These are all data points. In parenting, we say regarding our children that all behavior is communication, right? And most kids don't have the verbal skills to articulate what's going on inside of them, so they act out, right? They're behaving in a way that we don't like, and they're being a bad boy or bad girl, whatever. We react to the behavior. We don't think about the fact that they're actually trying to communicate something to us, but they can't because they don't have the words to do it. Okay? So what they're actually doing is communicating. Well, the same thing can be said for adults. So instead of reacting to the behavior, we need to ask the question, not why are you doing this? The question is, what's going on? Talk to me. What's going on? We notice and then we ask. So to our own behaviors, our body sensations, feelings, emotions, etc., they're all trying to tell us something. So it's important to listen and to even ask the question myself, wow, what's going on? I'm like really angry, or I'm like really fearful, or I'm really, whatever it is. I need to start asking myself the question, what is going on? Eventually, they will tell you something about yourself, something from days gone by, fears, difficult experiences, whatever. And marriages, our most intimate relationships, tend to bring to the surface the things that are outside our conscious awareness, things that have been lying dormant for a while. Because in marriage, there's a lot of vulnerability. So even if we've had a good upbringing, good home experiences, there are always things we can discover, things we can learn about ourselves. Second, though you may not be excited about the prospect of personal exploration that I'm proposing, that it may seem at the very least unappealing, at the very worst terrifying, if it's done slowly and in a safe and secure context, I can tell you this, it is liberating. You can snap the chain and wall, for good. It's liberating. We come to see how the past can keep us stuck in our present relationships, how past experiences actually control us and keep us from being able to be our true self, both in our marriages as well as in our relationship with God. Don't think for a moment that all the stuff that I'm talking about doesn't relate to our relationship with God. Absolutely does. Third, for me personally, learning about parts of my wife's life, lived experiences, as I said, I was previously unaware, was comparable to unearthing precious artifacts. That's how I see it, of which I was unworthy before. As I listened and learned, I began to see her differently. As I learned of her broken pieces, I saw her more whole, like a stained glass window. Many pieces, when arranged in the proper way, created a very beautiful image. Putting myself aside, which is absolutely key, and listening to her story gave me an even deeper appreciation for her. Things that I previously had a hard time understanding now made sense to me. It changed me and it changed the way we related to one another. And the same can be said for her as she has come to know me better through my story. It goes without saying that as we have taken the time and showed a genuine interest, our marriage has grown in Christ, who has blessed our efforts to love one another. Learning more about one another has given us insights and understanding increasing empathy and connection and appreciation for one another. We had learned to be on guard, to protect our innermost self when we were young. Being open and vulnerable was risky and it felt very dangerous. It was part of our narrative. What we learned, however, what Brene Brown said after years of research, is that, quote, vulnerability is the core of shame and fear, but it's also the birthplace of joy and belonging and love. We were afraid to see ourselves as we truly are because we were afraid of being rejected, of disapproval, and ultimately afraid of being alone. You see, we typically fight to survive instead of allowing ourselves to simply be as we are and accept it, and accept the love of Christ in the time and the place where we are. We don't have to be anything other in order to receive the love of Christ. It was while we were still sinful that he died for us. Christ meets us, accepts us, and loves us where we are in this place, in this time. And this is how we are to relate to all people in that very same way. Thank you. Now you can clap if you thought it was good. So I warned you, it was going to be a little different. If you want to talk about conflict resolution and communication, we can. But I think I did, but from a very different angle. And that was my intention. Yeah. Yes.
I went through a pretty drastic situation like this. I was in a number of relationships that were extremely unhealthy. And after my divorce, I had the opportunity to really work on myself. And everything you said today is exactly what I went through. And I think it took me like a year and a half of constant working on myself. And it was really scary at that time. But I was also chanting at church. And in Vespers, we have that wonderful passage which we say every single service. The bones that are humble, they shall rejoice. And every time I read that, I would just like know it inside me. And I might be feeling like crap right now. I might be in a really difficult place, but these bones, they're being humble, yes, but they shall rejoice. And I did. And in the long run, I look back and the part of my life that you would think would be the worst part ended up being the best, because it was because of facing my pain that helped me to be more healthy. So I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Thank you.
That this really works, and it changes you, and it changes your ability, even like in a situation where you were being mistreated, it gives you the ability to not react and instead pray for that person and let God use you. And then the other thing I thought of too is that, like you were saying, that sometimes you're like, well, I'm healthy, I had this, and there's areas in my life where I'm healthy now. And then I'll find a struggle. And I'm like, then I realize that God's allowing that struggle in my life so that I can figure out what the process is of how to get through it. And then I can teach it. And then God
that's
can
right.
use me to help my children.
That's right. The humble in heart, when they have that experience, say, Lord, thank you for showing me this. Because they know it's an opportunity of healing, because he's showing it out of love so that that healing can take place.
Right.
The humble of heart always thank God for these moments where we just may feel so uncomfortable or feel like maybe our world now is falling apart and we thought we'd made it a certain distance, any of that, but we just thank God for those things. Yeah. You had a question?
Yeah. So I've got this friend I really care about, and he came to there was a message about forgiveness and he's from outside the church. Really, yeah, been in church enough. Actually, some of you were just here.
You heard a message of forgiveness in the church?
Yes.
Okay, and it touched them.
Yeah, yeah, just sort of, and later, we were walking and he was telling me, asking me how you can forgive. I was trying to do some direction that I didn't have, but later that day, he shared with me some trauma in his life that I never heard like such purely distilled action that happened with his family. The worst I would imagine was murder, suicide, right? It's deeply,
Traumatized.
yeah, well, and that is like a barrier. He's ready to enter the church, but he doesn't know how to get past that. And so when
Not
somebody-
forgiving.
Yeah.
He doesn't know how to get past forgiveness.
Right, and with somebody at that point that wants to come in with that trauma, like, you know, advice or where's it good starting?
Well, on the one hand, I mean, someone who's had those sort of experiences, if he hasn't received help, trauma-specific help, because trauma therapy is really different than most other types of therapy. In fact, we're at a point in time in history of humankind that as clinicians, we really have to rule out trauma before we diagnose anyone with anything because of its prevalency. Okay. And it's a different, in many ways, it's a very different therapeutic approach. I mean, there are already established modalities out there that contribute to healing, right? The trauma treatment itself has some special things, and especially just the approach and the understanding of the therapist is critical. So that's an important aspect. Our ability to forgive is given to us by God alone. If we truly want to forgive, then we begin to pray from our heart that God blesses us and gives us the grace to be able to forgive the unforgivable in our human minds and hearts, and not to be afraid. Because what happens is that if there can be a part of us that's going to resist, even if we ask that, because this hidden hurting part of us in some way may interpret that as condoning behavior or letting someone off the hook or something like that. I mean, that more than anything, I mean, it's pain related to the experience, but it's also spiritual immaturity. But our maturity in Christ is very gradual. And all of these things are gifts that God gives us. But when he sees a heart that truly desires something like that, he'll begin to give it to that person in measure. And then the impossible becomes possible because through Christ everything is possible. Yes.
So we're here. I'm going to ask you to expand on what you touched on earlier about depression, and I assume that was depression emotion. I often reflect on the homily that you gave here, and I think you were talking about the context of reacting to children. Basically spoke about being quiet instead of responding, which kind of threw them off the sun and threw them in. Outside of our family influences growing up, the world kind of tells us, hey, you gotta bury emotions. Those are a problem. And
They don't tell you that it's more of a problem when you do that.
that's part of the question.
So I answered that part. Okay.
So I guess what I was going to ask, maybe expand on the depression part, but also on the reactive part. About your thoughts on that tactic of getting quiet.
Instead of reacting to your children when they're misbehaving?
Not just children. I mean, that was the original context that I heard.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that now, years later, and how you react in the moments to those triggers? That's kind of the question.
Well, as I said, I mean, the first thing is to notice. And then after we notice, then that's when we begin to wonder and ask what's going on. And for me, in my own personal work, you know, that's what I was striving to understand. I wanted to have a better understanding of what's behind me reacting in this way, in these situations or whatever. And as I began to excavate and sort of peel back the layers, then I began to understand where that was coming from. And that's a process that takes time. But for me, it is one of the most worthwhile investments that a person can do, because if we're just, not dealing with it, then it's always going to control our life. It's always going to show up in a way that's going to hurt other people, and also hurt us spiritually, because we're not living in a Christ-like way, So I don't know if that helps any, if that expands on it anymore. I don't know how much more to expand on it. I think it's just important to notice what's going on. And if I can't kind of make some of those connections, and if it's not with maybe a very trusted friend or someone I feel safe with sharing that with, then I take it to someone who's more of a professional who can help peel back the layers for me. Because I want to get to the bottom of it. And I'm constantly asking God to heal me from it too. That there's so much to be said. It'd be great if I could just go to God and just ask him for everything, and he would give it to me in that moment, or within a week or a month would be great too, But God works through other people. And there's something that happens in that relationship and that connection that's very, very valuable, that I come away with way more than what I was actually initially going in. It's like God is able to sort of work in these ways that there are these networks that just like, you know what I mean? It's just like you go with one thing, you want to talk about one thing, you're kind of working on one thing, and then you step back, it's like, oh wow, that like affected this person, affected my work, affected that, I do this differently, and it has all these touches that kind of happen, which is so beautiful. Because that to me is how God displays the abundance of his love. It's not just about me. It's me in relationship to everybody. So, yes.
You could speak more to what trauma is. Just like the evil things that happen, or is it other?
Well, there are a lot of experiences that we can point to that create a trauma response and embed themselves. I remember reading a story of a girl who, when she was little, I think it was in Peter Levine's book. He's one of the top traumatologists. And he talked about went to the doctor's office, and she had to get a shot, and she was terrified. So a nurse and her mom and another assistant kind of held her down while they applied the shot. Well, that was a very traumatic experience for her. So years later, she's in therapy with Dr. Levine. And as he's sitting there and talking to her, her legs just, kind of moving, people do that, And he's noticing this, right? And they're having this conversation, and it's not like she's, in this, like she's not speaking fast or out of control or anything. And but he knows what's going on, because the body keeps the score, right? And the body is the thing about trauma is that it always wants to work itself out. And if we're not helping it, then it's going to manifest itself in our body and through our body. If you look at adverse childhood experiences, that whole study that was done, acronym ACEs, you read about that. The amount of adverse childhood experiences someone has correlates highly, predictably, to heart disease and heart attack and cancer and on and on and on and on and on, all these sort of things. So the body always wants to get the trauma out. It's either being repressed, or we're consciously, it kind of pops up, we push it back down. But it's wanting to come out, kind of like a splint or a foreign object in your skin. It wants to work its way out, right? The body wants to push it out. So her leg is going. And so he knows, what's happening here. He heard about the experience when she was little, and he yells out to her, "There's a tiger in the room, he's coming after you." Like at the top of it, she jumps up and just starts running in place really, really, really fast, right? And she does this, for, I don't know how long, a few seconds. And she kind of exhausts herself, and she sits down. But in that moment, it was like he gave her permission to release that. And it sort of left the body, you know. So trauma and trauma can be experienced directly, or it can be experienced vicariously. There are therapists who work with trauma patients, and the vicarious trauma that they're experiencing, they end up getting PTSD. So you have to be really, really cognizant of that. But it doesn't have to be, you know, before PTSD was a diagnosis, back in the 40s, 50s, and maybe even 60s, I can't remember when it switched, but it was called shell shock. It had to do with, you know, soldiers from wartime and all that. But now, I mean, a car accident caused it. Bullying can cause trauma. You know, it's trauma really is, it happens when we are in a place of sort of helplessness where we can't do something about it. And we're just, you know, having this this threat, and the threat is any threat that we perceive is about life or death. Even if it's a perceived threat, it's always about life or death. And when we get into arguments with our spouses and we activate the sympathetic nervous system, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our adrenaline, all these things just get, you know, shot up and skyrocketing and all of that. We are in a trauma response. We are in a fight or flight. And we're acting as if my life is absolutely in danger. And our frontal lobe goes offline. We don't rationalize. We can't think. We can't be analytical. We can't be empathetic. We go back into the limbic system. We're animalistic, and we just, or we say, I'm out of here, and we flee, right? Fight or flight. Or people will freeze and just like shut down.
I just thought that was really striking, is that by studying your history and understanding the history of your life, you start to understand things that have influenced you. So these almost impulsive reactions, reactions don't take over and determine your conduct, but it's using the higher rational faculties of the human brain. And what's interesting about it too is that you have a low resolution map of your life, and you try to make it higher resolution. You also try to have a low resolution map of your spouse's life, and they told you things, and it can take years sometimes before it even registers. It takes, and humility, by the way, plays a huge part of it, because you need to recognize what you don't know, and it's real and it's powerful.
One of the things that the therapist who was working with my life and I said, because I was learning a lot, I knew I was sort of moving forward, but I was still getting stuck. And he said something one time. He says, when she starts sharing, he says, don't make it about you. Don't make it about you. And that's what I did all the time. I made it about me. Oh, and now I'm the bad. Or, you know, this is, well, what about, you know, it always came back to me. So when it comes to humility, that's very true. But when he said that, it was like a light bulb went out off of me. And so from that point, and again, that was years later, from that point, I was able to not make it about me. What did that do? It opened up the door for her to share and to be more honest and take risks in what she was saying, and know that I wasn't going to shut her down by making it about me. And in the past, I was making it about me, and so she never could get past what she really wanted to say, you know. That was my trauma response. So I was activated. So yeah.
When you said that you didn't make it about you,
When I said I didn't make it about me, what?
when you said that you weren't making it about you, what did that look like?
What did it look like? Well, first, when he said it, I knew exactly what he was talking about. I knew exactly what I was doing. So I made a conscious effort at that moment that the next time we talked, I was going to stay, I guess, in control. I made a conscious decision that I'm not going to react, because I realized what that was doing, how it was preventing. So it was a conscious awareness and then a conscious decision. And I remember one time, the first time we were sitting there and talking, and I felt it. I felt the fight or flight kick in, and I was just like prayer room. And I remember I was sort of like listening to her, and I was saying the Jesus prayer, and I was like, Lord, keep me at peace. I want to hear her. I want to hear her. This is not about me at this moment. This is about her. She is that precious person you have put in my life, in my hands to care and love for. I don't want this to be about me. So that sort of self-talk and prayer and preparation is what it looked like.
What do you propose a person to do in situations where only one person in the marriage wants to unpack the emotions and the other person does not because of their trauma?
Well, if that other person who doesn't want to sort of start sharing their story and those sort of things, okay, if they don't want to do that, they may still be willing to listen. I don't know. I think it would be hard because it's going to tap into a lot of stuff. So you have to go to a person where you can do that. For me, I was in counseling, at different times, but oddly enough, by the grace of God, one of the biggest defining moments in my change was my grandmother. Just that conversation. And I remember going to a seminar years ago by this, I forget her name now, but she's kind of big in the whole marriage stuff, and website books, and all that stuff. And she said, our marriages can change for the better, even if just one person is actually doing work. If I did nothing else in my marriage but to not make it about me, if that's the only thing I learned at whatever given time in our marriage, not to make it about me, that would have greatly changed my relationship in my marriage. Just that one thing. You don't have to go back and solve all the unsolved. There are these moments where God's grace just sort of visits, and drops these little experiences or these, and you have to listen for that in your heart too. And then you have to not fight it, because we can receive that grace and something that's really a game changer to change the direction in a better way. But we can even go into sort of a trauma response when God wants to give us something great. So again, that's just like, thank you, Lord. You're right. As always, you're right. Yeah, Joe.
So you're in one of those moments, right? One of the other.
Is this about you and me?
That's good. One of the two of you has been through. So when do you have that conversation? Because it seems to me that when you're triggered, somebody's been in. So how, is there a formula that says,
No, but
we gotta talk about this right now, or is it?
Definitely
and then
not.
how long is too long?
if you're higher brain functioning part, your frontal lobe, if that's offline, don't have a conversation. Don't. And I always tell couples, I need a timeout. Don't say, honey, you need a timeout. I just need a moment, because right now I'm just kind of triggered, but this is important. And I want to be able to be fully present and have this conversation, but right now I can't. So can we do this, a little bit later or tonight or something? I always tell couples, give that other person the time frame sort of when you're going to do it, because a lot of people are like, well, you always say that, but then we never talk, right? So I want to make sure that she knows it's very important, and that right now what I need is to regulate myself. I need to activate my parasympathetic nervous system, and I need to bring all that stuff down. And sometimes that may be a walk, sometimes that may be, reading, it could be listening to soft music, whatever it is that helps you sort of regulate. Something for me, oddly enough, is just lighting incense. It's like my brain goes, oh, we're in church, this is like really nice. So anything, so you have to get to that place, and then you come back. Yeah.
Is there any kind of unspoken, I don't want to say obligation, but for the spouse to really listen to the other person and say, okay, I really want to know, rather than, look, we can't talk about this. This is not a subject we can discuss, because we'll never see eye to eye on it. So let's just walk away and this is bury the hatchet and be done. And which would leave one person feeling, like you said, unheard and, unavailable, feeling unavailable.
If the two of you don't agree on something, we have to agree not that we're going to disagree and bury it.
Well, or there's a topic that is just sensitive, and it's like, boy, you've had this issue for years and I just can't deal with it. I can't manage the reality of having you unpack all of this and try to figure out where this came from so I can understand it. It's better.
Yeah, to me, that's a person who's in a place of exhaustion and frustration,
right,
and all of that. And
right.
And so it may be that the way that it's been attempted, and typically we attempt things in the same way, has never led to anything positive or different or change or understanding or anything like that. So that's when I would suggest people, you need like a third person or someone to work through this and see. Now, in terms of agreeing, we're not going to agree on everything.
Right.
I mean, I think John Gottman in his research and studies said that we don't agree with like 75% of stuff in our lives and stuff, like that.
So that being said, how do you deal with, or how do you view terms like validation and empathy and things like that without necessarily having to agree?
Oh, we can completely understand where someone is coming from and understand why they feel that way and how they see it that way and how that sort of creates whatever inside it. I can do all of that and still not agree.
Is that a healthy thing?
Yeah, because sameness doesn't equal oneness.
Right.
My wife and I are very different in many, many ways. But we then come to appreciate and sort of adore those differences. Because those are the things you're going to miss the most when one of you is gone.
Right. So then where do you balance, my last question, where do you balance empathy with accountability? Because when I grew up, I was always held accountable for every single thing. And so when I see out there in the world, an understanding, which I completely embrace what you're teaching, but I've seen it also, like, people get off the hook, as you said. It's like, oh, well, they can't help it, so they're just this way. Is there a point in time where a person needs to become accountable for their actions, regardless of what their family of origin, how it designed them, or how it molded or shaped them?
Well, I think the law will do that. But the law of Christ is forgive them, Father, they know not what they do.
Well, yeah.
Okay. You said if people took their lids, they should have a timeout. But what if that timeout actually triggers the other person feeling rejection and feeling like they have an immediate need to solve the problem? And it creates another problem.
Oh, that's so juicy. I know, right? That's great. Gosh, do I know that script? Oh. Yeah. It's so common. And it goes back to, what's going on in me that I feel so rejected right now. It goes back to what John was saying too. Yeah, all that's happening, response, trauma response, whatever. You can't talk about it. You can't do anything about it until everybody's in a calm place, and then you can have the conversation. In the moment. There's really nothing you can do except for just separate, get your peace, and then talk about, whatever it is you want to start talking about. But it always goes back to, and here's a very classic communication tool. Never use the word you.
Use the word what?
You.
I was never used. Not you, it was never used.
But when I heard that it triggered something in me. And as I've thought about it, what it triggered in me was a sense of rejection. And I know where that's coming from. And I know that the past jumped into the present, and when that happened, it triggered that. And then out of that, that's when I spoke to you in that way, and that was not right. I should have never said that. Forgive me, I'm sorry. These are the things that we're trying to develop. Because it's classic. I mean, our therapist, it was amazing what they said. So you say this, and then she says that, which creates this sort of reaction, and out of that reaction, this is what you do, which creates a reaction to her, because now she feels unsafe and fearful, and then she does this, and then she needs space, and then you feel rejected and abandoned. And I was just like, yes, that's it, that's great, that was the perfect summary. And so, I mean, having gone through all that, though, now we're so aware of it. We're so aware of it. So you presented a really juicy interaction. It was really great. And that happens a lot. So it's a matter of stepping back and out of it, to look at what's going on here in terms of what was happening in there. Does that make sense? Yeah. What time is it, by the way? I don't know if it's midnight or.
It's almost 9.
Almost 9. Okay. Like how much?
8:56. 8:56.
Okay. So you want to make this the last question or 2 more?
Well, then I'll pass on mine for something else.
Oh, no, your turn has come.
Oh, so I've moved a lot of people, like helping people move. And
Thank you for clarifying that. I have no idea where you were going with that one.
I find that at the end of every time moving people, I get frustrated, which I come to expect because, you get tired and you get hungry, and usually people pack all their cups, and therefore there's no good water.
It all makes sense.
It happens. And there was one time when I was helping somebody move with my dad. She's probably smiling right now because he knows exactly what I'm about to say.
He is, by the way.
It's 15 minutes in, and I'm already getting frustrated. Dad, I expect to get frustrated by the end of this, but man, I'm frustrated now. When it's those types of things, I usually find that the best thing to do is, eat something, drink some water, and rest. And there are some times when people bug you that you're like, I know it's not you, I'm just tired, or I'm just hungry.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also that thing that people always say, like, don't let the sun go down on your anger and never go to bed angry. But I find personally, the best thing for people annoying me is go take a nap.
For them or you?
For me. Go to bed and I wake up and I'm not angry anymore.
Okay.
How do I deal with one person who wants to hash out everything before you go to bed, and the other person for whom going to bed is the restarting of the computer?
So I think it's we have to be very honest, right? And 2 things. So the first part is just like, I'm really exhausted. I'm not going to be at my best, but I really do want to have this conversation, but I can't do it right now. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go to bed. Let's talk about it tomorrow when you're free. That's all.
But it's living in that commitment to come back to the conversation.
Well, you have to honor the commitment, or else you have no integrity. And then the person will say, well, you always say that, but you never do it. So that's another thing to explore. Aren't you fulfilling what you're saying you're going to do? Yeah, one more question.
It all folds into it, but it's like, you have that moment of awareness, like, hey, I'm having a strong emotional response in the moment. I have to get past that unlearning, like communicate, say, tell the other person, hey, I'm getting this strong feelings, I need a moment to just feel it, process it.
Yes.
So I'm not reacting, I forget that step, and then that causes the problems you're concerned. Emotions are causing you to react instead of act, and it's like, but just take that, like, hey, just so I'm feeling triggered. It's not. Give me a second, and that has alleviated things a lot. It's when I don't take the moment to acknowledge to myself, I might internally have a dialogue about, hey, I'm feeling something, but not expressing that outward. Early years, you just kind of press that. And so it's like, I don't realize that I'm starting to realize that.
And that's what's liberating about talking about what's happening in the moment. if we're not living and if we're not processing, we're not talking about what's happening in the moment, that's what is leading to a lot of these issues. So it's okay to talk about that. And you can have that conversation when everything's fine. Look, in the future, if this happens and we know that you notice something about yourself or me or whatever, let's just say it and let's move on. But you know, what's really important here too is that it kind of goes back to what John said too. When I'm not ready to talk about something, whether I'm sort of distressed or I'm just exhausted or whatever, and I say, look, I can't do this right now. When I say, but this is important, I'm saying you are important, we are important, this is important. I better darn well believe that. I have to really believe that. And if I don't believe that for some reason, then I got something else I got to start working on. Because then I'm attached. And that to me is even scarier. Like what's going on with that? And if you grow up with an insecure, avoidant attachment style, that's a very prevalent thing that happens. You know, because I have learned in my upbringing, for example, I have that attachment style, that I cannot count on you. It's just a matter of time before you abandon me, leave me, deny me, or whatever. So I'm just sort of waiting. So I desire closeness. I desire to be in union with you, all these sort of things. That's my heart. That's natural. That's God-given. But my experience is it always ends, and I'm always the one being sort of whatever. So this idea that I can be sort of unconsciously guarding my heart from truly giving it to my beloved, and loving her, that's something else I have to look at. But I have to know that that's kind of what's going on too. You know. Especially that it gets the last.
It's very powerful because it's the person. And I also like the prayer. I think that the prayer that you came up with, I feel like if you were to say that in the morning and have that open heart to God, like, I'm broken. I'm speaking to anybody here, but to myself, like, I'm broken. I don't see myself rightly. I don't see my spouse rightly. God, help me. Well, it's very powerful because we don't always have the ability in those situations to like be empathetic or be kind or give the person space or not be a talker. But like we're putting that all before God. We're saying, I want to change. I want to love my spouse. I want, that is, even though it's a small prayer, I think like how you're saying you have to want that God can work so much through that because we're giving our heart and
One of the faculties of the soul, as the fathers of the church speak about, is epithemia. It's desire. And he gave us that faculty of our soul to desire him so that we would want nothing more than to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors ourselves. That is God-given. It gets dispersed into all sorts of things in the world. I mean, we become attached, and our treasures, where our heart now is, it can be on material things, it can be on all sorts of things. But when we pray from our heart, because our desire is to truly love the other, and Christianity is all about the other. Just plain and simple, it's about the other. If that's truly our desire, and that's what we pray for, God will give it to us. He is obligated to give it to us.
Because we're not even saying, I'm going to be able to analyze how to act. This, like I'm going to fail when that situation is presented and I'm probably vulnerable. And like, there's like a sense of surrender that there's a lot of hope there.
Yes, and we have to believe and have faith that he will give it. St. John of Kronstadt talks about that. I remember reading that in the book when I was living on Mount Pavlatos 30 years ago. I remember that phrase. He says, when you ask God for something, you have faith and you believe that he will grant that. But when I say that though, I'm talking about the virtues or anything that is godly and holy that really will transform us. We have to have that faith. And for me, it took me to be in such a place of pain and just, oh, I'm just done, to be able to say that from the heart. Because I was going to change myself. I was going to change my, I can do this. I just need to fast. I need to pray more. I need to do this, I need to do that. And it's just like perform. Where is that coming from? Remember my story, my narrative, right? That's how it affected my relationship with God. I got this done. If I sleep on the floor instead of my bed, I will become more holy. If I don't eat any sort of, if I become vegan, I'll start to become more holy. If I read more prayers, I will become more holy. I'm doing this. You got it. I'm doing this. I got this. And Christ is like, you don't have to do anything. My love for you is completely full, and I've already given my life for you. I want you to be who you are, and as you are, just come to me. I'm here. But we're trained, we have to perform. We live in such an evaluative world. Everything is about progress. It's about evaluation. It's about grades. It's about performance. It's about promotions. It's, we're so locked into this world and that sort of mentality that we just take that right over into our spiritual life. It is one of the devil's greatest deceptions. And then I feel like crap about myself. Well, I should, because I've shut Christ out of everything. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. So. Don't get me started. All right. John, do you have anything you want to say in closing, or do you want me to just say a prayer? I don't know if people want to.
It's all on you, Father.
Okay. Well, let's stand. Well, before you stand. Sorry. Simon says. Oh, you can stand. No, don't stand. So tomorrow, we have Orthodos at 8:30 and liturgy at 9:30 for Saint Sophia and her daughter's faith, hope, and love. And then after that, I think we have a little refreshments and so forth. And then we have the second session. And then do we have a lunch after that? Yeah, a little lunch. Yeah. And then we have the third session. So the second session is going to be a lot like this one. It's more of a lecture, but we'll do this sort of thing too. After lunch, I prepared less because half of you are going to be asleep. So, and then we'll just open it up for just sort of more questions about anything and everything we talked about. Okay. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being my test group on this newly created talk. And hopefully tomorrow you'll be able to get something that God has hopefully given me to give to you. So let's rise. We'll close with a prayer and then be able to go. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O Christ our God, you are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and you have completed the divine dispensation of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness, always now and forever to the ages of ages. Amen. Okay. Have a good night and drive safely.